Then the assembly rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king." Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered, "You say so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no basis for an accusation against this man," but they were insistent and said, "He stirs up the people by teaching throughout all Judea from Galilee, where he began, even to this place." When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had been wanting to see him for a long time, because he had heard about him and was hoping to see him perform some sign. He questioned him at length, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Even Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then he put an elegant robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. That day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before this day, they had been enemies. Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was perverting the people, and here I have examined him in your presence and have not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he has sent him back to me. Indeed, he has done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him." Then they all shouted out together, "Away with this fellow! Release Barabbas for us." Barabbas was a man who had been put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found him in no ground for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him." But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be sacrificed, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. He released the man they asked for, the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder, and he handed Jesus over as they wished. So we want to explore the theme of forsakenness through the character of Pilate. But before we do that, I just want to give you a background on the roles that came with being a governor during the time of Rome's occupation. Pilate was in charge of collecting taxes, so he played an economic role in the community. He was responsible for keeping the peace, which means he had a policing role in the community. And he presided as judge over legal trial, which means he had a judicial role. He was a leader, he had power, and his power gave him a ton of responsibility and influence over other people's lives. And when it came to Jesus' trial, he was the person responsible for sentencing, and his decision alone influenced the fate of Jesus' body. He had the power to set him free or to let him hang on the cross. When it came to Jesus' trial, Pilate's judgment literally meant life or death. There are different versions of this story in the four Gospels, but in all of them, Pilate is depicted as one who struggles with what his insides are saying versus what his colleagues and the crowd are saying. While the religious and political communities are screaming, "Crucify him," Pilate's insides are saying, "He is innocent." In Luke's gospel, Pilate goes back and forth with the crowd 3 times. He even sends Jesus off to be examined by Herod, who also finds no reason to condemn or sentence him. In Matthew's gospel, Pilate's wife urges him to let Jesus go after being warned in a dream. She says, "Have nothing to do with that innocent man." The fight within Pilate and around Pilate had to do with innocence versus guilt, but the struggle for Pilate was, at the end of the day, about who he chose to listen to. Should he listen to his role and the specific duties that had been placed on him? Should he listen to the people he served? Should he listen to Herod? Should he listen to his colleagues in Rome? Should he listen to the Jewish religious authorities? Should he listen to his wife? Should he listen to his own wisdom, his own doubt, his own intuition? Should he listen to the evidence being presented? Should he listen to Jesus, the one whose life is at stake? In Luke 23:23, the text tells us, "Their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted." Their voices. The hyped up crowd, their voices, those threatened by Jesus' message, their voices, those who expected Pilate to do his job, the loudest voices, the voices of pressure, the most demanding voices, the voices of threat, their voices. Their voices win in this story, and way too often in this life. What happens when we forsake the truth within and let their voices prevail, whoever they are? Jesus died that day because Pilate chose not to listen to himself. Jesus died that day because Pilate said guilty when he knew Jesus was truly innocent. Jesus died that day because Pilate allowed himself to be convinced that their voices were more important than the voice of his heart. There is a lot of loss that happens when we choose to forsake our own truths, when we allow the voices of others to prevail against our own internal wisdom, when we forsake the still small voice for the screaming crowd. And there's even greater loss when we do this as leaders. If we are in a role that grants us power and authority over others, that gives us responsibility and influence, and our capacity to listen to ourselves instead of forsaking truth in favor of the crowd can mean life and death for those we serve. Rumor has it that Pilate's career got worse and worse after Jesus' crucifixion. Tradition tells us that his next move as a leader included a massacre of Jews who were protesting near the temple because their religious offerings were used for political projects. Years later, he was responsible for ordering the military death of a large group of Samaritans who were merely gathering for the purpose of finding old Mosaic texts at Mount Gerizim. These two events happened within 6 years of Jesus' death, and then Pilate took his own life not long thereafter. There is no doubt that Pilate, in many ways, was responsible for forsaking Jesus. But he also decided on that day to forsake himself. As a person in leadership, my heart recognizes something in this story that I'd rather not think about too much or for too long. And that's how easy it can be for leaders to begin to forsake the voice of truth and opt instead for the voices of the crowd. And once you start, how routine that can become. And how when you're in that routine of listening to the crowd instead of listening to your own wisdom, how routine it can become to participate in violence or exclusion as though it were the will of God. Pilate's life is a warning to all of us. There is a connection between forsaking one's own truth and participating in institutional violence. Violence that can even turn you on your own self one day. Today, In our institutions and the crowds we frequent, there are often ideological wars going on about who is innocent and who is guilty. May we never ever forsake the voice of truth within, no matter what the crowds or the pastors or the politicians or the legal systems have to say. In John's gospel, Pilate is quoted as asking, "What is truth?" right before handing Jesus over. What is truth? Something tells me Pilate could have spent a little more time with that question. A little more time with himself and his wife with that question. A little less time with the crowd, a little less time in his role, and a lot more time in his conscience with that question. What is truth? What is truth? I don't know, but it shouldn't be forsaken. Amen.